All right, guys. So today we're having Roger Guimera, which is researcher from Catalonia, and we're going to be listening about symbolic regression. So you can take the floor, Roger. Looking forward for the talk.
So thank you very much for having me, Omar. Let me see if I can share my screen. Can you see my screen? No?
Yeah.
Can you see a presentation full screen? No?
Yes, it's in full screen and it's
okay. Okay, so thank you much for the invitation, Omar. It's very nice to be here. It's humbling too. When I looked at the list of people that are at this in this neurosymbolic programming project, I mean, I recognized a lot of the people from whom I regularly read papers, right? So it's it's very nice to be here. It's a bit scary too, I have to say. Also because I come from a different tradition from most of you, I guess. I'm a physicist by training, and I still consider myself a physicist, although I've been doing work in many different topics over the years, from social sciences to biology, physics, of course, and then a little bit of machine learning lately, right? So what I want to talk about today is Bayesian symbolic regression. And actually what I want to do is to go in some detail. I want to go about with some level of detail on basically two works that we've done. One on proposing a new method for symbolic regression that tries to deal with uncertainties as best as possible. And the other, some results that we've been getting recently about the possibility of actually discovering closed-form mathematical models from data. Okay. But because, as I said, I'm a physicist by training, and probably our scientific cultures are kind of different, right? I wanted to start by illustrating, by giving a little bit of background on this culture, right? What are the problems that we are interested in, which I suspect are different from the problems that people in computer science are often interested in. And then a little bit about how we got interested in symbolic regression and how we identified some limitations in what was then the state of the art. And we tried to solve them using probabilistic approaches, basically. And well, so I want to start again with the sort of problems we are interested in. And we tend to illustrate this with a data set that is very, well, it's relatively famous in physics or very famous in fluid mechanics or for mechanical engineers, which is a data set that was collected in 1933 by this guy here in the picture, whose name was Nikuradze, okay? And he was interested in measuring the friction that fluids experiment or feel when they go through a rough pipe, okay? So imagine that you have a pipe with walls that are rough, and then you try to push a fluid in there. And because the walls of the pipe are rough, there is some friction, and you have to put energy to push the fluid through the pipe, right? So that costs you energy. Energy is dollars, right? Now we are particularly aware of this fact. So mechanical engineers are interested in this sort of problem, trying to understand what happens with friction in rough pipes, okay? So he devised some experimental equipment, and then what he did is he took the pipes and coated them with grains of sand, okay? So he went to the beach and separated grains of sand by size very precisely. So he had what is called monodisperse distribution of grain sizes. And then he coated the walls of the pipes with sand in such a way that he could tune from more roughness to less, okay? Depending on the size of the grains of sand that he chose. Okay, and then what he did was the following. He measured. Here is a reproduction of the graph that is in his thesis, and what he plotted was the friction that was felt by the fluid as it was traveling through the pipe, as a function basically of the velocity of the fluid. Okay, so what you see is at the beginning, the more velocity you have, the less friction you have. Okay, because, well, it goes faster and there is less friction with the pipe. But then at some point, and that does not depend, this region here does not depend on the roughness of the pipe. But then at some point, depending on the roughness of the pipe, you start having different behaviors, okay? So each of these curves correspond to a different level of roughness, okay? At the top, you have more roughness, so you have more friction. And at the bottom, you have less roughness and you have less friction. So you see that the curves that describe the friction as a function of the fluid velocity and the roughness of the pipe are somewhat complicated, right? They go down, they seem to be very smooth, right? So there seems to be, it seems like there should be a mathematical expression that describes these curves, but that it goes, they go up and then up and down and then up again. There is a limiting behavior. It seems that it's stable for very large velocities and so on, right? So the thing is that people have been trying to model this. So this, again, these were experiments from 1933, and it's almost 90 years later, almost, right? And people are still struggling to find analytical expressions for these curves. So we still don't have an analytical expression for this. So the question we are interested in is, can we find analytical expressions for this sort of curves, right? So I understand this is the typical machine learning problem, right? The difference perhaps that what I wanted to illustrate is that this problem is like, I mean, we don't have millions or 10 to the 7 points or anything like this, right? Our points are, in this experiment, are not very noisy, but they have some noise, but they are not terribly noisy. So again, the kind of problems we as physicists are interested in, and our collaborators, perhaps biologists, are typically different from the kind of data set that computers scientists have, like 10 to the 7 images that I want to classify, or 10 to the 10 or whatever, right? So these are the sort of problems we're interested in. And of course, the problem we want to solve is the typical problem in symbolic regression. I assume that most of you know what symbolic regression is, but still I'm going to give you a few hints of what it is, how we see it, if you want, again, to bridge this culture gap that there might be. So again, what we want to do is to find a given target variable, right, as a function of some features and probably in some parameters, okay? So in the Nicoraz example data set that I just showed, the target would be the friction, and the features would be the independent variables, if you want, would be the roughness and the velocity of the fluid. And again, we want to find closed form expressions for this. Okay, the closed form part is important, right? So we want to find expressions that are not, we are not interested in models that have 10 to the 8 parameters, right? We are interested in models like the models that physicists and engineers have been using for 100 years, let's say, right? Or more. So this is what we mean by closed form mathematical models. They are typically models like these ones, where you have the function that is the object of our analysis, right? What we want to obtain. And they are typically expressions with only a few parameters and only a few operations, right? And we use not only products and sums, but we also use trigonometric functions, exponentials, logarithms, hyperbolic functions, and so on. And we are basically interested in any closed form expression of this type, right? So we don't put any limitations on the sort of expressions that we are interested in. So in this case, of course, this is a linear model. We've seen many linear models in our lives. This is a complicated model, but in principle, they are all acceptable models in our setup. Okay. Okay. So what I want to tell you today is how we design this, what we call this machine scientist, which is a Bayesian symbolic regression approach. That what it does is to take data on the left, right? It processes, well, it takes this data and it builds closed form mathematical models. Okay. And it does it by realizing that mathematical expressions can be represented as graphs. So I will give a bit, a lot more detail on how we do it. Okay, so again, the second part of the cultural background that I think is relevant for the talk, so that everyone understands where everyone comes from, is how we got into this, how we got interested in the problem of symbolic regression, right? And this was basically following the paper by Smith and Lipson in Science in 2009, in which they proposed a symbolic regression. They build up on existing symbolic regression approaches based on genetic algorithms. And for instance, they took systems like a double pendulum, which is a system that for physicists, it's very famous because it's chaotic, it's very complicated, and so on. And from data and using a computer program, they detected invariants in the motion of the pendulum. In this case, the Lagrangian or the Hamiltonian, or things that are very interesting to physicists, right? So again, physicists spend many years trying to find the Hamiltonian of a system. So it was kind of very impressive and really like shocking, even I would say, to realize that some people were writing programs that were able to write the Lagrangian of a system or find equations of motion, if you want, right? So just to give you an idea, for those of you that might not know exactly how genetic algorithm-based symbolic regression works, this is how it works. The key insight, I think, and the one that we are going to be using in our approach, is that any mathematical expression can be represented as a tree, as an expression tree, right? Like this one here. So in this case, the expression y equals z plus 2 sine z can be represented like this tree in here, right? So it's z plus 2 times sine of z, okay? So then, okay, we have a way to represent closed form mathematical expressions, the kind of expressions that we are interested in. And then the question is how we find the best mathematical expressions for a given data set, right? And the way, let's say, standard symbolic regression does it is by using genetic algorithms, okay? So what they do is they build a population of trees, of expression trees like this, and then they introduce some mutation and crossbreeding or crossing moves that allow you to go from one expression to another, right? So for instance, by mutating the plus sign in here, you are allowed to go from this expression here to this other expression here, right? And here you have what that means in terms of fitting the data, right? And then in the crossbreeding, again, you have a population. You can take parts of one expression, parts of another expression, and cross them, okay? As in standard genetic algorithms, okay? So this, in fact, was introduced in '92, at least, probably earlier than that, but by COSA in 1992, right? There was already a chapter in the book on genetic algorithms that discusses this sort of symbolic regression, right? Okay, so this is where how things are done. Now, of course, again, it's a genetic algorithm, so you need a bunch of things, right? You need a loss function that you, in this case, you wouldn't call it a loss function, you would call it a fitness function, right? You need a fitness function that tells you how good a given expression is, given a data set. And you need some rules to do these mutations and this crossbreeding and to evolve the populations, okay? So when we read this, as I said, we were very impressed, but at the same time, we realized that there were a bunch of limitations, right? And then actually we started using this. At the time they had, Omar and I were talking about this earlier, they had a software called Eureka that at the point was free to use, at least for academia. So we started using it and realizing that there were a bunch of limitations, okay? And okay, so the first two limitations that go hand with hand is that you need to define many things, right? You have freedom and you don't know how to do it to define a bunch of things, right? The first one is the goodness of fit. Like you have to decide how you quantify the goodness of your model with regards to your data. So, or you can call it loss function or whatever, or cost function or whatever you want, right? You have to quantify the goodness of the fit. And at the same time, you need to penalize model complexity, okay? And the reason why you need to penalize model complexity is because there are many models that are very complicated out there. Like if you want to build mathematical expressions, there are many very complicated expressions, but there are very few simple expressions, right? So if you don't penalize model complexity, just by an entropic effect, you go to very complicated models, right? Just because there are many more complicated models than simple models. And again, so you need to penalize model complexity. And again, you have to decide how to do it, right? So typically what people do is every time I put an operation, I pay a price, right? And that's how I penalize model complexity. Now, the third limitation that we identified is that both this goodness of fit and model complexity need to be balanced, okay? So this is typically done in the following way. You have one axis that is the complexity of the model, right? Or in this case, the inverse of the complexity. So on the left, you have complex models, and on the right, you have simple models. And then on the other axis, you have the goodness of fit, right? So at the top here, you have very predictive models, and at the bottom, you have models that are not very predictive. And then you define a Pareto front in here, right, of the models that are optimally predictive for a given complexity, okay? And then, well, you still have to choose, right, what level of complexity you want. You know that more complexity will give you better fit to the data, but you still have to choose. So this is another limitation, right? To us, we tried to change parameters and like this, and it was always disappointing, right? Sometimes we were getting models that were too simple, sometimes models that were too complex, and so on, right? Okay, and the last limitation, so to speak, is the fact that the way you explore the space of possible mathematical models is heuristic, right? You are using genetic algorithms, so you are not guaranteed that you will find the best models, right? Like genetic algorithms have a tendency to identify models that are good, but we don't know if some sort of particular set of models that are very good will never be explored, maybe because they are difficult to get to by these crossbreeding and mutations and so on. Okay, so these are the limitations we identified at that point. This was a long time ago because we started working on this a long time ago. But of course, the state of the art has advanced a lot with respect to those papers, the 2009 papers. But I would say that the state of the art still mostly suffers from most, if not all, of these limitations, right? You need to define arbitrarily goodness of fit or loss function, penalize complexity, and balance all of these. Okay, so what we thought is that what we wanted to do is to try a probabilistic approach, because probabilistic approach in principle are optimal when you have uncertainty, right? Like in this case. In this case, we are uncertain about which is the correct model for a given data set. So we thought that the probabilistic model would be appropriate, right? And in a probabilistic model, what you try to find is the probability, in this case, in the case of symbolic regression, the probability that a given model is the correct one given the data, okay? So if you have this conditional probability of the model or this posterior probability given the data, you have the whole explanation, like the whole answer to your problem. This is the complete description of your problem. So, okay, so what I want to do in the talk today, I've explained the motivating example. What I want to do next is to formalize the problem and say how we solve it. Then see how we can use it to solve the, to give some insight in this data from Nicorazzi and turbulent and so on. This will be very short, just to illustrate that it works and that we can do interesting things with it. And then discuss this part related to the existence of fundamental limits in model learnability, right? The fact that at some point we might not be able to learn the correct model. Okay, so let me start by formalizing and addressing the problem. So what is the problem that we want to solve, really? Just to be a bit more precise, okay? So what we want to do is the following. We have some model like this model in here, right? This is a closed form mathematical model, C1 times X1 times C2 plus X2 cosine of X1, right? So it's a model that depends on two independent variables or two features, X1 and X2. And that has this shape here, the shape of the surface here. So typically, there is a model that has generated the data. We generate data with this model, okay? And the generated data are the points that you see here. So in general, these points have noise, so they are not nicely laid out on top of the true model, right? They typically deviate from the model. And what we want to do is to run a program by just looking at the points here, run a program that can learn the mathematical expression that generated the points. Okay. So again, the insight that what was key for our work was to take on what people in symbolic regression had done, which was to realize that expressions can be represented as these little graphs here, as I mentioned earlier. And then from this perspective, the problem of finding the best model, which seems like a very complicated model, a very complicated problem, sorry, becomes a problem of identifying the best graph, right? What is the best graph, the best expression that we represent as a graph for a given data set? And this, let's say, network inference is the field from where we came from. So we thought this was an appropriate problem for our methods, right? So there are basically two challenges, right, that are related to the limitations I mentioned earlier. The first one is how we evaluate the goodness of a model or of each graph. And the second, how do we explore the space of possible models? Okay, so these are the two. I'm going to go in some detail into these two things. Okay, so the first thing that when it comes to evaluating the goodness of the model, we use again probability theory, right, or Bayesian inference if you want, or Bayesian model selection if you want. But it's just probability theory, right? So basically, the idea of the basic idea of Bayesian model selection is the following. So suppose that we have some data, and we want to say something, or we want to select, well, in general, say something, but in particular, select what is the plausibility of model M. Okay. So what Bayes' theorem tells us is that the probability of model M being the correct one given the data can be written in terms of the probability of the data given the model times a prior probability of the model. Okay, So basically what this tells us, if we want to evaluate the goodness of a model, the plausibility of a model, what we have to do is first assign to models a given probability a priori. And so this priori is the probability that we assign to models before seeing any data, right? Just with some criteria that I'll discuss later. And then there is the likelihood, that is the probability that the data that we see are generated with the given model that we have chosen. And that's the proper way of updating the prior when we see more data, right? So Bayesian model selection can be thought as a process in which we start without knowing anything about, or knowing very general thing about our models that are encapsulated in this prior. And then when we start seeing data, we keep updating those beliefs about which are the plausibility of models in this way. Okay, so this is standard Bayesian model selection. By the way, this is just Bayes' theorem as you learn it in high school, right? So again, this is what I've just written in the previous slide. It's the probability of selecting the model. But now what happens in real life and in the models we are interested in is that models have parameters, right? So typically, we don't just select one model versus another. We select a model that can have many possible parameters, and we want to compare to a model that has many other different parameters, right? So we have to be aware of that. And basically, I don't know if I need to go into the details too, but the idea is exactly the same. You write the exact same expressions, but now you separate, instead of having the model, everything characterized by letter M, encapsulated in model M, in letter M. Now we say that our model is a combination of two things. F is the functional structure of the model, like the tree that we presented earlier, and the parameters theta. Okay. And then again, you do exactly the same as we did before, and you go to this expression. So it looks more complicated, but it's exactly the same. Whenever you have M, you put the structure of the model and the parameters of the model. And now the second step that you need to evaluate the goodness of the model is that you are not interested in knowing the probability of a model and a set of parameters, but you are interested, remember, on the probability of F alone, right? You don't care about the values of the parameters. So in probability theory, when you want to eliminate the effect of one variable, what you have to do is to integrate over that, right? So if we want to know, or you marginalize, right, using the technical word. So if you want to know the probability of the function f being the correct mathematical expression for your data, what you have to do is to integrate over all the parameter values theta, the thing that I've written up there. Okay, so this is basically all the math that you're going to see here. So don't get, if you are not aware, I mean, if you haven't seen this before, don't be too scared about this, because it's not complicated, really, right? So you are applying Bayes' theorem to model selection, and then when you have parameters there, you have to marginalize over the parameters, because you don't want to know, you don't want to compare a linear model with A equals 1 and B equals 2 to a parabola with 3 values of the parameters. You want to compare a linear model with a quadratic model, right? Regardless of the parameters of the values of the parameters. So then the expression is the same as before, but instead of the likelihood that you had before, you have what is called the integrated likelihood, right? Which is this integral here. Okay, very good. So there is an information theoretic interpretation of this whole thing that I think is useful in terms of talking about the problem. So this is what I've written so far, right? What this is called the posterior over the expressions, right? The probability of the expression f being the correct one given the data. This is exactly what I've written before. It's the prior times the integrated likelihood divided by this thing. By the way, we don't care about this thing because it doesn't depend on the model, so we can forget about the denominator here, right? And this is just notation. This expression here can always be written like the exponential of some quantity L. Okay, up to this is just a definition. I'm defining L so that it's this thing. Now, with a little algebra, you can see that L is actually minus the logarithm of the joint probability of the model and the data. Okay, and that's what in information theory is called the description length. That's the number of bits I need to send you if I have an optimal algorithm to send you the model and the data. So if I want to send you the data by email, this is the minimum number of bits that I will have to send you for you to recover the data and the model using the model. Okay, so this has a physical interpretation. This is the number of bits, right? So when we compare two models and we say that one has a shorter description length, it means that it compresses the data better. Okay, so this is a very objective way of quantifying the goodness of a model, right? And so, okay, so this is the Bayesian. In Bayesian terms, you would say that the best model is the model that maximizes this probability, right? It's the most plausible model given the data. In information theoretical terms, you would say that the most plausible model given the data is the one that compresses the data the best. It has the shortest description length. So I'm going to call this L, the description length. And the description length, by the way, is minus the logarithm of the integral here, minus the logarithm of the prior. Okay. So, okay, there is a statistical physics interpretation. Statistical physicist, just because I'm a physicist, we have the, I don't know, the tradition of calling this description length energy. So it's exactly the same. So I might sometimes call the description length energy. It's exactly the same. Okay. Minimizing the description length is minimizing the energy, is finding the optimal state of a system, right? Or the most stable state of a system. Okay, so again, what are the arguments for a probabilistic approach? So, well, I don't know if I want to go into this because I'm going slow, but basically all the arguments that you use to justify the use of probability theory for dealing with events that have uncertainty are applicable here, right? So there is a Cox type argument, right? So there are the Cox theorems that prove that if you want to reason with plausibilities in a quantitative manner, you have to use probability theory, right? If you assign probabilities to events or to models in this case in a way that is not the same, is not this one here, then you are violating some very basic common sense considerations. Okay? So that's what comes out of Cox theorems. If you assign plausibility to models in a way that is not what I did with the posterior probability over models, then you are violating some very basic rules of common sense. Then there is the Dutch book type of argument, right? That says that, okay, if you and I are betting on which is the correct model, and you are not assigning plausibilities using probability theory like we've seen, then I can always find a set of bets that is called a Dutch book that you will find agreeable. You will agree to buy this set of bets and that guarantee that you will lose money. Okay, so this is another argument for using probabilistic approaches. Then there is the consistency argument, right? So you can prove that this approach that we proposed is consistent. So when you have infinite data, it tends to select the correct model, with probability approaching 1. Okay, so any approach that in this limit of large data sets does not agree with the probabilistic approach, it's for sure not selecting the true model in this limit, right? And finally, there is the information theory argument that I've already outlined. So any alternative way of selecting models will result in models that compress the data less, that are less compressive of the data. So good models are able to compress the data very well, capture a lot of the structure in the data. Bad models do not. Okay, so this is all very nice, but the question is, can we do something with it? Like we have this integral here, can we do something with this? And the short answer is yes, that we can do. And again, the short answer is that this description length, under some assumptions that I will not go into here, can be approximated as what is called the Bayesian information criterion divided by 2. So the Bayesian information criterion of the model divided by 2 minus the logarithm of the prior probability of the model. And now all you need to know about, probably you all know or you heard about the Bayesian information criterion, but all you need to know is that this number is something that I can calculate from the data. If you give me a model and data, I can calculate the Bayesian information criterion. That's not a problem. So this part of the description length I can calculate without a problem. Okay. So the question is, how do I assign probabilities a priori to models, right? How do I decide before seeing any data that one model is better than another? So let me spend 5 minutes in explaining how we do this. This is a bit dirty, maybe for you. For physicists, I think it's okay. They tend to like it, but computer scientists tend to frown when we go into the definition of the prior. It's an empirical definition of the prior, okay? And it's based on the following idea. The idea is that as scientists, we do have prior expectations about the plausibility of expressions, right? So at the beginning, I showed these two expressions here. One is a linear model, and the other is a very complicated model involving logarithms, trigonometric functions, exponentials, and a strange exponent. So a priori, if you ask a scientist which of these two models is more plausible, I would say that virtually everyone would agree that a linear model is more plausible a priori. Okay, so we have, as scientists, we do have these expectations, and the question is, how do we convey these, or how do we encapsulate these expectations into this prior probability over models? So what we did is, okay, how do we learn this? How do we learn to have these expectations as scientists? Well, because we spent 4 years in college, or probably more before, studying mathematical expressions. So some expressions look familiar because we've seen them many times, and some expressions look strange because we've never seen something like the logarithm of the sine of the exponential of x to the minus 8. Okay, so what we did here was the following, and bear with me for a few minutes. Okay, so we went to Wikipedia and searched for all the mathematical expressions that are written in Wikipedia. Okay, so for instance, we went to the web page of the law of gravitation, and we searched and we found this expression here, and then we parse it, right? And we see that in this expression, there is a product here, there is a product here, there is a ratio here, right? A division, and there is a square power, or a power of 2 here, right? So what we did is we went and counted for all the expressions in Wikipedia how many operations of each type they had, okay? And what we got was this histogram here, right? So for instance, this is the number of appearances that each of these operations makes in Wikipedia, and expressions in Wikipedia. So the most frequent is the product, the second most frequent is the sum, then the division, and so on, right? So, and then we said, okay, so we don't know much about expressions. All we know is that a priori, an expression that has a product should be more plausible than an expression that has a hyperbolic cosine, right, for instance. So in fact, what we did is to define a distribution over models that has, on average, this number of each type of expressions. Okay, so to be a bit more precise, and I'm late, so I will go skip quickly through this, but we choose the maximum entropy prior that is consistent with this frequency of operations. So again, when we say that we go to Wikipedia and look for this, we don't only consider expressions for Wikipedia or anything like this. We just look at the statistical properties of the expressions in Wikipedia, and we assume that expressions that are statistically similar to the expressions that we have in Wikipedia are more plausible than expressions that are dissimilar, statistically dissimilar. Okay, and the maximum entropy prior is the least informative prior that satisfies this. Okay, so this is how we fix the prior. Okay, so with this, we've solved the first problem. Right now, if you give me, let's look at here. If you give me a model, I can calculate the Bayesian information like this part of the description length, and I can calculate the prior, which I've specified like this, and I can give you the description length of the model. So for any model you give me, I can give you the description length. So the second problem is, okay, now that I can assign a description length, a goodness to each model, how do I explore the space of all possible models? And the way we do it is by using Metropolis Hastings. Okay, so basically, we want to go from one expression tree to another, starting, for instance, from this expression, C1 times X. And then what we do is to implement a bunch of moves that allow us to go from one expression to another. For instance, we have a root addition move that takes this expression and adds a root to it. So in this case, plus C2, right? So this adds terms to the expression. We always have the reverse movement, in this case, root removal, to go from here to here. Then we have another move that it's elementary tree replacement, we call it. We can replace this like the crossbreeding in the genetic algorithms. You can replace this part here by an X, for instance, or by another expression, simple expression like this. And finally, we can have like the mutations in the genetic algorithms, right? So sorry, I can play with this, but anyway, we can replace the node plus here by a node divided by. Okay, so the key idea, of course, we are using the Metropolis Hastings rules. We have to algorithm. We have to sorry, there are some rules that tell you with which probability you have to accept each of these moves and so on, but it can be done. So in the end, what we have is what we wanted, right? For each expression, we can assign a description length. And then we can explore this space of description length, right? So each model has a description length, and we can jump from one model to another. Okay, so if you got lost, now is a good point to catch up. We have defined the machine scientist that we wanted to define. Let me drink a little bit of water. Okay, so again, given an expression, we can calculate the description length of that expression of that model. And then we can explore the space of possible expressions using Metropolis case teams. Okay, so compared to the standard symbolic regression and the limitations that we identified at the beginning, we have that we had the limitation that we needed to define the goodness of fit. It was arbitrary. Some people use cross-validation error, some people use root mean square error, whatever, right? But for us, using the probabilistic approach, the maximum a posterior, which is the same as the minimum description length, is imposed to us by probability theory. We are not free to choose anything in there. Then we saw that as a limitation that we need to penalize model complexity, and we have to come up with some rules on how we penalize models. Here we need to like the same role is played by the prior, right? So we need to specify a prior, but at least the assumptions we are making are explicit and transparent. Okay, so in this case, we're assuming that a priori expressions are similar statistically to Wikipedia expressions. And we could change that if we have a problem at hand that is on one particular problem on signal transduction. We could take a book on signal transduction and use that prior. Okay. Then in standard genetic symbolic regression, you need to balance goodness of fit and model complexity by using the Pareto front. In our case, goodness of and complexity are all together in the description length. They both play a role at the same time in the description length, so you don't need to worry about them. They are automatically balanced. And finally, we have replaced the heuristic exploration that is given by the genetic algorithms by sampling from the posterior using Markov chain Monte Carlo. Okay. Okay, so now the question is, does this work, right? So we wanted to, remember, generate some points and try to see if we can recover the expression. So this is what I'm going to show you in this video, okay? So basically here you have the points, and the surface is the model that the Bayesian symbolic regression is exploring. And in these graphs here, you are seeing the description length that should go down to the minimum description length, and the absolute error that should, because in this case we know what the true model is, we can calculate the error with respect to the true model, which should also go down. Okay, and you can focus on the blue lines here. You can forget about the others. And you can see that indeed description length goes down, error goes down, and eventually you find the correct model and more or less stay there. Okay. Okay, so I have like 10 minutes, I think. So, okay, so we've done, I formalized how we address the problem of Bayesian symbolic regression, how we define model plausibility, which is the description length, and how we do the sampling, which is Markov chain Monte Carlo. So now let's see if this provides some insight in some physical problem, right? So remember, in this case, we wanted to model these curves here, especially in the region of high velocity, right? So this region here. So what we do is we take the data, which are the gray points here, and we feed them to the machine science, to this Bayesian symbolic regression that we call the Bayesian machine scientist, right? And sure enough, the Bayesian machine scientist finds some expressions, in this case, relatively ugly, but that fit the data pretty well. Okay, so we are finding good models to describe the data. Okay, but of course, this is just fitting the data, right? So I think it was John von Neumann who said that with three parameters, you can fit an elephant, and with 4, you can make it wiggle the tail, right? So perhaps this is not very remarkable, right? That we are able to fit the data with this, even though the fit is good. So we do other experiments that are more interesting, like this one here, for instance. So in here, what we are doing is we are training the machine scientist with the gray points here, okay, and then asking the machine scientist to predict the black points. So the red is the Bayesian machine scientist, and the other colors are several other algorithms that, well, symbolic regression. The green and orange are symbolic regression approaches, and blue is Gaussian processes, right? So standard non-parametric machine learning approach. And you see, and what you have in the inset is the mean absolute error. You see that the generalization error of the machine scientist is considerably better than the others. Right? So again, note that these experiments are extrapolation experiments. We are asking about some range of data that the machine scientist has never seen, right? And here we do the same. we train with the gray points and we validate with the black points. We test with the black points, which again involves some extrapolation. And again, the machine scientist, that's much better than the others. Okay, so I'll leave it at here. I will just say that, well, this part here, I still have a few things to say, but just let me mention that if you combine, like the expressions that we got were relatively ugly and not very insightful from the point of view of physics, but if we combine the machine scientists with some knowledge that people have about how this curve should behave, about some properties that this curve should have, then we do get models that are interpretable and that provide insight even from the point of view of physics. Okay, so let me skip this. So I want to spend the last few minutes talking about whether there are fundamental limits about the ability to learn models from data. So I want to, going back to the initial slide where I showed what the goal of the problem was, right? Given some points with noise, we want to identify the surface. It's underneath here, the closed form expression. So there are two intuitions, right? The intuitions are two limiting cases. So one intuition is that with enough information, if you give me enough points, right? If you keep giving me points more and more, we should eventually be able to recover the true generating model, right? With enough data, we should be able to recover the true model. Okay, in fact, this is more than an intuition because as we've seen, the description length is a consistent estimator. So you can prove mathematically that in the limit of infinitely large data sets, you prefer the correct model with probability that tends to 1. Okay, so it is an intuition, but it's also something that can be proved mathematically. Now, the other thing, we didn't know how to prove mathematically, but it's also very intuitive. Well, I guess there should be a relatively easy way to prove it. But the other intuition is that if you keep the number of points fixed, right, like here, but you start increasing the noise and making the noise larger, bigger and bigger, eventually you might not be able to detect the correct model. Okay, so imagine this model here goes, the values of this model go between -5 and 5. But imagine that your noise goes between 10 to the 10, it's of the order 10 to the 10, right? So then this variation in 0.5 is totally meaningless, it's totally undetectable. And in this limit, you should not be able to detect the true model, even if there is a true model, right? So what we wanted to analyze is whether this is true and how this happens, right? So we defined the learnability. What we did is to generate synthetic data, basically, and see if the models, so this is the model I've been showing you so far. So we tried with this model and with a different model just to make sure that it wasn't just a fluke of a given model, right? And then we define what is learnable. We say that the model is or this data set, to be more precise, is learnable if the description length of the true model is the shortest possible one. In other words, we say that the model is learnable when, well, a model is learnable from a given data set when the true model is the best description of that data. Okay, there might be other models that are not the models that generated the data that are better descriptions. So again, we say that the model is learnable if the true model is the best description of the data. Okay, and then what we do is to generate many data sets and see whether we can learn the true model from the data or not. And that's what we call the learnability. Okay, so here we put this learnability as a function of the noise in the data. And when we have learnability 1, it means that for all the data sets that we generate with this level of noise, we can always discover the true model. Okay, so we generate many different data sets, and no matter what data set we choose, we can always learn the true model. And then what happens is that this learnability is 1 until a given value, when it goes very fast, it goes down very fast, and very soon the learnability becomes 0, which means that for no data set generated with this level of noise, you can learn the true model. Okay, so this is with a small number of points, with 25. But if you increase the number of points, you have the same behavior, right? It's just that this transition moves to the right. Okay? And again, with model 2, the point at which this transition happens is different, but you still see this transition. Okay. Now, okay, so just to finish, we provide a very simple argument of why this should happen, right? And the argument is the following. So imagine that you only have 2 models, okay? One is the true model that generated the data, okay? and the other is a trivial model. Say it's a constant, okay? So f equals a constant, right? Okay, and then what happens is that at each of these models, for each of these models, I can, and at each level of noise, it can assign a description length, right? And of course, there are other models that are not the trivial model or the true model in between, but I forget about these models for now in this argument. But the idea is that when there is low noise, the shortest description length is achieved by the true model, and the trivial model has longer description length, okay? But then when you have high noise, the reverse happens. So you have the shortest description length correspond to the trivial model. And again, this is because, as I said, when the noise is 10 to the 10 and my data are changing in -5 to 5, the best model I can propose is a constant, right? Because it's a simpler model, it has shorter description length than the true model, and it describes the data equally poorly, right? So the idea here is this, right? So our assumption is that we only have two models that matter, the true model and the trivial model, and that depending on the level of noise, one is better than the other, or the other is better than the one, okay? So if we can calculate the description lengths of these two models, and this is what I'm plotting here. And what if this hypothesis is true, what we should see is that at each level of noise, so this is the solid line is the description length as a function of noise for the true model, and the dotted line is the description length for the trivial model, for the constant. And if our hypothesis is true, what we should see is that the best model at each level of noise should coincide with the minimum of the two. So it should be like the true model at low levels of noise, and like the trivial model at high levels of noise. And indeed, what we find is exactly that, right? So this is the description, the best description length that we find. So it seems that despite being a stupid model, right? Well, the stupid explanation of what's going on with only two models, it describes the data pretty well, okay? And then what you can do is you can calculate this crossing point, you get an expression, not very important. But the important thing, and this is the last slide with content, let's say, is that if you plot the learnability of the different models, here we have the two models as a function of the scale noise, so the noise divided by this crossover noise in which one model becomes better than the other, then you see that all models are on, and all data set sizes behave very similarly, right? And you have this transition where you go from learnable models to non-learnable models. Okay, so this is all I wanted to say. Just to conclude, to take home messages, basically, we can identify cross-form mathematical models from data using this Bayesian approach to symbolic regression. It solves some of the problems that we think standard symbolic regression has, and even the state of the art in symbolic regression based on neural net, deep learning, and so on have as well. And this is very nice, and sometimes it helps us to learn something about physics or about biology or whatever, but there are also fundamental limitations. There are some situations in which it is impossible, we believe, to learn the true model, right? Okay, so with this, I finish. Thank you again for the invitation. Thank you for being here. I want to thank the people that collaborated, well, the collaborators in these projects, which are listed here, especially Ignacy Reichard and Marta Sales, which are authors of all the papers that we've done on the machine scientist. Oscar Fajardo on the last paper on detectability, on learnability, and the people that fund the research. And again, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much, Roger.